Well, hello, everybody. It has been a long time. It has been a good while since I've put a podcast out there. And as I was thinking about doing this, I thought about I didn't really want to do the polished version, mostly because that's so time consuming. And, to be quite honest, realistically, maybe with the exception of one or two videos, not a whole lot of people were like, "Yeah, I like this," and got a ton of views. The ones that got tons of views were where I was going off the cuff. So I think I'm gonna call this podcast "Awaiting Christ Off the Cuff." Basically, just me off the top of my head, going over some thoughts, going over some ideas. What I wanna talk about today, any of you have followed me for any length of time will know that realistically, my social media following, I guess, if you wanna call it, really didn't take off until last June. And I think I may know why. I think I finally figured it out. It wasn't so much content or anything else. I think what it was is I was verified now on X, right? That was around that time period that Elon started rolling that out. And as a result, supposedly, he was going to push out content from verified users more so than non-verified users. So I honestly think that's what happened is since my account is verified, the X algorithm took it and it just exploded. And I think it was just kind of like a perfect storm of circumstances. It just the content plus my position plus the algorithmic boost. I think it all served to just kind of explode into what it is now. I think last June on X, I had something like 1,900 followers that I had worked for like 3 years to get to that point. I think from about 400. It had been another account that I called something different. I repurposed it for a disciple's point of view, which later became Awaiting Christ. And it took me 3 years to go from 400 followers to 1,900 followers. And then last year, again, it exploded. I have a screenshot of that post that just exploded. And yeah, I've just, it's so much interaction. I cannot keep up with it, which in some ways is good. And it has brought out what I want to talk about over a next series of podcasts that are going to be off the cuff. So, everybody likes a good origin story, right? Everybody wants to know how something came about. So, how in the world did Awaiting Christ get to the position that it did? Maybe some of you think that, maybe some of you don't care, who knows? But I'm just going to go ahead and go over it as a basis and a foundation for what I want to talk about in coming weeks. And I think what I'm going to do is probably release every Wednesday for this summer at least. I'm going to try anyway. So, what I want to talk about today is when I first became a believer in Jesus Christ. I was 20 years old. I've talked about this before. I was at college, guy talking to me about witchcraft. I said I kind of wanted to learn the same thing, and he inadvertently shared the gospel with me. And that was the moment God used to just open my eyes to the truth. And I have been following him ever since. But interestingly enough, as all new believers tend to do, and as you probably will recall having done when you first came to Christ, you took that Bible and you devoured it, meaning you just read it for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. You just could not get enough. And man, whenever I was first reading it, I had no inclinations that I had to interpret it a certain way. I let the word speak to me, right? So whenever the scripture says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever shall believe in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life," I took it at face value. I took it as that's exactly what it meant. The words meant what they said what they meant, right? Even though I couldn't read Greek at the time, I'm not like Lee Brainerd, where it's like I teach myself Greek, and I probably should though. But at any rate, I took it at face value, meaning also that when I got to the Old Testament, started reading the stuff about Israel, I just simply, well, that has never occurred in human history. The Jews, by and large, I do know for a fact, still largely reject Jesus Christ as Messiah. So clearly, prophecies like Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 40, where he talks about he was going to make a new covenant with the house of Israel, the house of Judah, and they would be careful to follow his laws, etc., whatnot. It's like, yeah, I knew there were Jewish people within the church, current believers in Messiah Yeshua, but by and large, the Jewish people don't believe in Yeshua or Jesus, as we Gentiles say. So I knew that was in the future. That had to be something in the future. I had one person on X tell me it's like there's no way you arrive at what's called the dispensational position without being taught it. I completely, utterly, totally disagree. Maybe the finer points of dispensationalism, sure. That, there are X amount of dispensations, whatever. My main thing is that I believe that there is a future redemption for Israel as a whole. Of course, as Zechariah prophesies in chapter 13, verse 8, it's only going to be a third of them. But he will again turn to Israel. He said, "You will not see my face again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" And they're going to look upon the one that they pierced, Zechariah 12, verse 10, and they will mourn because they ended up rejecting their true Messiah for thousands of years as a collective people, and then they will embrace a false Messiah that will kill two-thirds of them in what is called, what we have nicknamed, the Great Tribulation, mostly because Jesus said it first in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24. But I arrived at the distinct and utter position that God still has a future for Israel. And when I came on X some 29 years later, and I started espousing what I believe, and what I have always believed since becoming a Christian, I was told, "You're a dispensationalist." And I was like, "I've heard the term. I never really studied the millennial positions. As many of you know, I have just wrapped up my first academic year at seminary, so I've only spent 2 semesters actively studying this stuff, like intensely. And I had always dabbled around, read books and stuff like that, but as anybody who knows me knows, I have a hard time finishing books because I'm like, oh, that book looks good. Oh, that book looks good. So I have a hard time finishing books. And plus, it's just time has always been an issue. But at any rate, I got told, "You're a dispensationalist." And I'm like, "Okay." And I'm like, not 1,000% sure what that means. So when I started looking into it, I'm like, well, yeah, I could see God dealt with humanity in different ways throughout the scriptures. That's pretty clear. I mean, you go from the covenant under the law of Moses to the covenant under Jesus Christ in the age of grace. It is vastly different. So it is clear that at least God has at least two periods or dispensations, which I know the covenant theologians be like, exactly, it's the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. I think, though, it's like you could look even before that, before the Mosaic covenant, there was clearly something in place that God was using. If you look at the book of Job, which is touted to be the oldest book of the Bible, as far as like, chronology and the timeline, there was a distinct and clear knowledge of God. But there was no real laws in place. It was more like they were led under conscience. Everybody knew who God was. He was very distinct in the world. Nobody denied him. They were certainly, atheists were likely few and far between, if at all. And people were also few and far between because we're talking like, towards the beginning of creation. I reject theistic evolution. I reject evolution. I do not believe that that is how the world and the human race and the universe came about. I believe in special creation. I believe that God created everything. So you can clearly see throughout those scriptures, yeah, God dealt with humanity in different ways and in different fashions, right? He required different things of his creation to himself. That's pretty clear. And it's pretty clear it's going to be a little bit different in the future, too. So I don't think dispensationalism is far off the mark. And when you look at the other choices out there, um, they're not compelling at all. The reason why I don't think they're compelling at all, when you have amillennialism that says there's no millennium, which I'm like, well, that's a problem already because Revelation 20 says there will be. And a lot of amillennialists say that's the strength of it because it's only in this one spot. Well, guess what, folks? In John 14, verse 6, Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes into the Father except by me." That is the only exclusive statement we can find anywhere in the Gospels. You can find allusions to it. It's very much like whenever in John 1, verse 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God." And then you skip over to verse 14 in chapter 1, and it says, "And the Word was made flesh and made his dwelling among us." Clearly means Jesus is God. And some people will say, well, you don't find that in any other gospel. And I'll contend you don't find it directly, but you find it directly whenever Jesus would know their thoughts. None of the prophets were ever touted to know the thoughts of other people. You would see that God made things clear to them, but the prophets did not know the thoughts of the people that they were talking about. Jesus did in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels. Um, anyway, I'll just leave it at that. Anyway, so we find exclusive statements sometimes only in one verse, but we don't worry about that. The covenant theologians, I'm sure, would not worry about that. The amillennialists would not worry about that, but they'll say that about the millennium because it only says it one place. Whereas we have within the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, a plethora of passages about the coming Davidic kingdom that was promised to the descendant of David forever. Forever. But somehow that's fulfilled in Jesus in the current age. And I got to tell you, folks, if that's fulfilled in the current age, I don't know if the Lord is somebody I'd even want to follow. I don't know. Oh my gosh, that's a blasphemous statement. No, it's just true. I mean, if Satan is currently bound and this is the best that it's ever going to be, well, I may as well be a Buddhist or a Hinduist because this world is awful. You'll then have the postmillennialists that say the world's getting better in every day in every way. They sound like New Agers. Folks, I was not raised as a Christian. For the first near 21 years of my life, I was what you would call basically an agnostic. I believed there was something out there, didn't know what it was, but I honestly also could have cared less. And when I was working at a bookstore, those things at stores that used to sell books, you remember what stores were? Anyway, I jest a little bit. But at any rate, the bookstores were always filled with the New Age section, and the New Age section is very close in my mind to the occult, and it was very fascinating to me. You know what the New Agers would say? The world's getting better in every day in every way. So I see the postmillennialists, either they're so optimistic that they're blinded to the world around them, or they're somehow closer to the New Age movement than they would like to say. I mean, a lot of what you would call the Christian nationalists, the one who basically want to bring The Handmaid's Tale, which is a TV show that was made, I want to say about 5 to 10 years ago. The way that the America in that story is depicted is exactly what the Christian nationalists want to do. And folks, that's terrifying because they want their version of Christianity, well, what is called Christian theonomy. They want to make that the law of the land. And it is fundamentally, as a working model, no different than a Muslim caliphate. And it is terrifying to behold and think of. So amillennialism isn't compelling. Postmillennialism, too many syllables there, is not compelling. Premillennialism, that's your third view that's out there about the millennium, believes that Jesus will come before 1,000-year literal reign on the earth, and he comes before that, right? So amillennialism means no millennium. We're currently, I guess, in that time period. Postmillennialism would say we're currently in the millennium. It's an undefined period of time that is likely going to last hundreds of thousands of years, and the church will bring about the golden age of the gospel. Well, in 2,000 years, we've yet to see much fruit of that. As a matter of fact, the world seems to be going darker and darker every day. Premillennialism makes perfect sense in the grand scheme of things in the world. Totally does. If you look at, I believe it's in 2 Timothy chapter 4, where Paul talks about perilous times in the end, right? Or maybe it's 2 Timothy 3. That is the one thing, folks, that I have learned is that chapters in the Bible did not come about until the 13th century. Verses did not come about until the 16th century. So realistically, I could sit here and say 2 Timothy about halfway through the book is, for well over 1,000 years is exactly how they used to refer to scriptural texts and refer to them instead of like in John 3:16. That didn't come about until it was about 500 years ago. So just a little bit of trivia for you there, folks. Whenever I can't remember chapter and verse, remember those are not inspired. Those were actually put there by man, although they're extremely helpful. At any rate, Paul talked about there will be perilous times in the end, right? That fits perfectly to what's going on. The world's getting darker and darker and darker and darker. And if you don't believe that, I mean, look at the war in Israel and Gaza. That the war in Russia and Ukraine. Russia currently is threatening to basically turn the UK underwater. I don't know how exactly, but probably just nuking it into oblivion. And they're currently on the war. But China is rising as a superpower in the world, and communism, it's not going to be too free, folks. You're not going to be free to do much of anything. You're going to have that social credit score. And if you step out of line, you're going to be locked in your house or maybe even a dungeon somewhere, and they're going to forget all about you. North Korea, it's the same thing. They're rising as well. You have Iran, who is they lobbed 300 missiles at Israel. Israel being the only democracy and I guess you could say liberal nation state in the West, which I know I say liberal nation state and it sounds like, oh, that's a horrible thing. But you and I, folks, we live in a liberal nation state. We believe that people should have freedom. We believe people should have a voice. We believe that people should be able to live how they want, right? Israel's not much different. And it's the only area over there in the Middle East that's like that. It's the very, very minimum. That's a good reason to go ahead and support Israel because of that alone. At any rate, premillennialism is the only thing that addresses all that. And within that camp, there are two thoughts and ideas. One is called historical premillennialism because apparently it does go back pretty far. It goes back to the 2nd century, probably 100 years or so after Jesus ascended into heaven in Acts chapter 1. Probably because it's like, well, we thought he was coming right back, but he's not back yet. So they started coming up with alternate ideas about how this is going to transpire. And if it's one thing I learned too, whenever I took an exhaustive study in class in the book of Revelation, is there are four views about the book of Revelation. You have the idealist view, you have the historicist view, you have the preterist view, and then you have the futurist view, right? Obviously, I'm a futurist. I believe that that's all still going in the future. However, what I found was that the historical millennial position typically interpreted Revelation very similar to how the idealists, which by the way, most your biblical scholars are idealists when it comes to the book of Revelation. They believe basically it's just a whole book of symbolism about the struggle of good and evil, and that's all it is. That's all it is. It's not prophetic script at all, despite the fact that the book says that it is a book of prophecy. At any rate, the historical premillennialists would interpret a lot of Revelation the same way idealists do. Okay, I look at the text and I'm like, this means what it says. It's not just some ethereal thing. Now, I'm going to talk about this more next week about what a quote unquote literal quote unquote hermeneutic is. And that's literally how you interpret the Bible. Okay, and even people will say who don't believe in the point of view that I have will say, well, even you don't interpret everything literally. Do you believe this verse? Blah 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 blah. Okay, I'm going to talk about that next week. I'm not going to address that here, but I will address that next week. Okay. So, the only view that makes sense at all to me whatsoever is the dispensationalist, futurist, premillennial position. A lot of words in there, blah, blah, and no. And to be quite honest, I'm not a great fan of labels. But I find that when you put your ideas out there into the stratosphere, so to speak, you get a lot of voices coming back at you, right? And that has been a learning experience. It's been a deep, rich learning experience, oftentimes quite frustrating, but oftentimes it makes me realize I did not know that view was out there. I didn't know that view was out there. I just recently learned that there is a movement and belief that believes that Jesus was all good and pure, but Yahweh, as a God, is a liar and not to be followed. Yes, that is a view that's out there. And I'm like, this is crazy. But I saw people pontificating that just about a week ago. And I just, yeah, I just, whatever. I'm like, yeah, I can't even today. That's enough internet for today. so, so I really wanted to just kind of talk about this for a few moments, and it's almost been 20 minutes now. I wanted to talk about this for a few moments about the origin story of awaiting Christ. It literally is about what is literal. I like the term plain sense, and again, I'll talk about that more next week. But I like when you look at a text, you can tell, such as Galatians 4. Paul says he's using an allegory about Hagar and Sarah. That Hagar is basically the mountain of works and Sarah is the mountain of grace, in essence. So Some people will sit there and look at that and see Paul is using an allegory, so we're going to use that across the whole of the scriptures. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. It makes sense to interpret that passage as an allegory because Paul tells you he's using an allegory. Quite often, Jesus would speak in parables, right? That is a literary device that people use to illustrate spiritual truths. Is there truth in the parable itself? Possibly, but there is actual truth, such as the parable of the prodigal son, right? You have a son. He is an heir. He decides he's got he needs to sow his wild oats, and he wants to go ahead and get his inheritance now. Which in that culture back then, you were basically saying, "Father, I wish you were dead. I want my inheritance now." Well, in the parable, the father gives it to him, right? The kid goes and he lives a decadent life. He ends up in the pig pen, covered in the pig slop, and he just longs for their food because he's like, "Well, at least they get to eat all the time. I don't. Maybe I'll just go back to my dad and I'll say, hey, I'm not worthy. Just make me a hired hand just so I can eat every day and maybe have a roof over my head." But instead, when he got close, the father was not only looking for him, he ran out to him and he embraced him and he brought him back in. No questions asked. Guess what, folks? That's grace. Jesus was illustrating the covenant that he was about to institute, the age of grace, where he would freely offer salvation to anybody who will take it, anybody who would receive it. He's doing all the work. He did everything that was required, but we take it unto ourselves as a free gift, just like the prodigal son did. So did that situation really happen? Who knows? Maybe. But the truth that it provides is a literal, absolute truth. And I was about to go off on, some interpretations about other things, but it's like, no, that's more about the literal hermeneutic, and I'll talk about that next week. So, folks, I just went off for about 22 minutes. I hope you all enjoyed this. I hope that maybe this is something that you want to listen to more of and that you will enjoy. Please let me know if you like it. If this is on YouTube, please comment. If it's on X, please reply to the Live Long Day, as so many of you are very good at doing. And I'm so grateful for every one of you, even those that hate me, that you give me a platform to be able to spring forth the gospel from, hopefully to others who don't know him. Um, but I hope too to edify you. I hope to build you up. I hope to give you some sort of nugget of truth. Whenever I go to training classes for work, I oftentimes have been doing it so long, I look for nuggets of truth here and there that I could utilize in my everyday life and my everyday professional life. It's the same thing. Anytime I read a book, anytime I listen to a sermon, anytime I listen to a podcast, I look for nuggets of truth that I can implement into my own everyday life and walk with Jesus Christ. And I really hope that maybe for some of you out there that I'm hopefully able to do that. So this ministry exists only to spread the gospel and to edify the believers in Jesus Christ. So let me know if you like this, and I'm going to talk to you next week about the what's called the literal hermeneutic of Scripture. We'll see you next week.